Welcome everyone to this chess video. We're about to do what seems like the impossible. It looks like a superpower would be calculating so far, like Hikaru Nakamura. Like, you've seen this guy, like, is this for real? Like, yeah, he's one of the best players in the world, but what most beginners and intermediates don't necessarily realize is that you can also calculate like this, and it has nothing to do with calculation ability. There's actually a secret concept at play here, and so I'm going to show you this with these players here. A related Grandmaster game I'll show, a really good example from Capablanca where he uses this exact same principle, and finally a game of mine that I played online, where all of us are using this exact same technique, and hopefully after this video you'll be able to as well in your games. Alright, so let's start with this, which actually relates to the Grandmaster game I'll show very soon. Now you might be a little bit suspicious when you see the players named by things like Mr. Orange or Mr. Metallic, but pay attention to the moves because these are going to be some really high level moves by these players. So the game begins with pawn to e4, and then we have a Scandinavian defense with d5, e captures d5, and instead of the queen recapturing the d-pawn, we have knight to f6, looking like it gambits a pawn. Now Mr. Metallic is your classic case of being very materialistic and very computer-like in their assessments, and so they see the fact that they basically just got a pawn, and it looks to be a free pawn, so now they'll try and defend this central pawn. They play pawn to c4. And Mr. Orange, being a good player, they just play c6, and they don't mind. And of course, Mr. Metallic is very happy to do so, because they're ready up a pawn as white, and they think, well, if I trade, they take back, so what? I've helped them develop a knight, but I am up one pawn, and being up material, we can trade to an endgame, and we'll just outplay black. What white is not realizing here is that this piece development is really important, and even though white is technically up one pawn of material, if you see the evaluation bar on the very left, this position is actually about equal. There is compensation for that pawn. It's not only the slight lead in piece development, but it's also the fact that black is going to have some open lines for their pieces, namely the queen with the d-file half open, and maybe even this bishop able to develop somewhere like b4 in the future. Black has very swift piece development, and it's not going to be as easy for white to continue the game. But material shouldn't be discounted either, so the game continues to knight c3. Black plays pawn to e5, fighting for the center. d3 just reinforces the center, and also supports one of the key central squares. This pawn is supporting the e4 square, and according to opening principles, these are the four central squares you generally want to be controlling. So really this move is just following opening principles, and might also help develop the dark square bishop somewhere like perhaps g5. Black plays a developing move, attacking the base of the pawn chain. Knight to f3 develops. Pawn e4 tries to put a lot of pressure in the center. It gets a little bit interesting with d captures e4, knight captures e4, and then this is the critical moment I really wanted to focus on with this example. We'll show a few more moves later, but first I want to discuss this real split that happens here. So the split is whether we should play simple or this other variation we'll take a look at. Now the simple and very human looking move is just play bishop e2. It may look a little bit passive, but we're simply trying to get castled, and white has a fine position here. The variation is going to be very long and computer-like, and it'll look like something Hikaru Nakamura might calculate with all of those arrows. Now instead of using arrows, I'm going to play the moves on the board, but I'll intentionally go quick and kind of read them off like Hikaru Nakamura would. So the line starts with bishop to e3, black will play bishop to b4, then white has queen b3, queen f6, rook c1, bishop to h3, queen c2, bishop f5, bishop d3, knight captures c3, b captures c3, queen captures c3 check, queen captures c3, bishop captures d3, knight d4, castle queenside, knight captures c6, bishop captures c3 check, rook captures c3, b captures c6, pawn to f3, rook d7, and then Mr. Metallic declares that king to f2 is a very smidge advantage at about 0.22 advantage for him. That is about 1/5 of a pawn, and this is something they're really happy to go into with a very minuscule advantage going into the endgame. Now, I don't know about you, but if Mr. Metallic actually foresaw all of that in the game, I might be a little skeptical that he's perhaps cheating. That seems very computerish, and for him to say that very odd a line. For example, he played bishop to h3. Like, did anyone else notice that? Now, before I go into the line, I want to discuss this move a little bit as well. It's not terrible. The very top engine move instead of this is actually just play pawn a5, which is a little more human-like. You simply defend the bishop, frees up this knight to move, and then you don't have to worry about threats like maybe white bringing the knight here long term, because this knight can simply capture it. without fear of losing this bishop. The engine calls this position roughly equal, and it's of course because I can't capture this bishop, because then that would lose the knight. And also with attack on the rook, it's just not really worth it. But the problem is this move accomplishes absolutely nothing. It's not like they're even threatening to capture here, because bishop captures g2 recapture would just defend the knight, and black has lost material for nothing. So there's really no point at all in putting this bishop here. But in that long Hikaru Nakamura-like line, that's what this player has calculated. And if it goes exactly as he foresaw, he'll end up in this position, which apparently he's slightly happy with. Now, who exactly is this Mr. Metallic and Mr. Orange? Well, you'll catch the reference if you've read Jeremy Silman's book, How to Recess Your Chess. His 4th edition book has this exact example, where Mr. Orange is probably International Master Jeremy Silman himself, or at the very least a player who is well versed in the imbalances, and Mr. Metallic is your stereotypical computer-like evaluating chess player, which he kind of describes in the book almost like a disease. Because the problem is, even if he correctly identifies, as he has in this position, that white is a minuscule edge advantage of about a fifth of a pawn, what does that exactly mean? That does absolutely nothing to help this player convert into a win. Even if I were to say that white is half a pawn better, how do you quantify half a pawn? And if you have no plan on how to proceed from there, that minuscule advantage literally means nothing. So Jeremy Silman recommends in his book, ask yourself this one simple question. What's going on here? You can even try it in this position. Ask yourself what is going on here. And if you can answer that question, then you can make a plan moving forward. But very often, especially if you're evaluating like a computer with these centi-pawn evaluations, you're not understanding how to convert a fifth of a pawn. And if you can't convert that with engine-like precision, then it's actually a waste to be thinking in those terms. Now let me go back to the human-like move, and not the variation with bishop to h3 that we had in the bishop to e3 line, but instead the very natural bishop e2. And I'll continue a few more moves here, but now let me go to that Grandmaster game that I referenced. You may recognize this exact position. That's right, the exact game that Mr. Metallic and Mr. Orange were playing was identical in moves to this Grandmaster game. But taking out the silly engine evaluations with moves like bishop to h3, let's play a few more moves to see what really happened. Bishop to b4 was really played, bishop d2 breaks the pin, but kind of walks into some nasty trouble themselves on the d file, and also the idea that there might be a trade here. And so black actually gains a bit of an advantage, but it's going to take a little while. They captured on d2, knight captures d2, knight to d4, advancing into enemy territory, rook to c1, black just castled, knight f1 was a weird looking move that kind of had to be played to try and relocate the knight to e3. The reason knight f1 had to be played was because if white ignores it and tries castling, knight captures e2 is a check, and if you recapture you're actually losing material with queen or bishop capturing d2. And so to avoid losing the exchange, knight f1 was played to try and relocate. Queen g5 was played, knight to e3, defending the g2 pawn. Black continued developing rook a to d8. h4 was intended to kick the queen, queen to f6 back. White castled safely. Now we have the trade here, but on the queen recapture, black plays bishop d3, winning material here, and effectively winning the game. But let's go back to the critical moment here, when we play this very simple move. How far were these Grandmaster players actually looking in this game? This is move 9 that we have here, and at the very end, in this position, this is move 17. Did both sides really see 8 moves, which is 16 ply? See, ply is a chess term that basically means like half a move. If you play e4, e5, that is still one move, that is turn 1. When white plays e4, that is 1 ply, and when black plays e5, that is the second ply of the game. So basically, there's 2 ply in every move, and ply basically just means one side moving but not the other. So did they really see 8 moves in advance or 16 ply? Very unlikely. And also, white definitely didn't see it, or they wouldn't have walked into this variation where they lose material. No, what happens instead is Grandmasters and very strong players usually only see maybe 2 or 3 moves advance. They may be like Hikaru Nakamura and calculate really deeply if the position calls for it, but in most positions, they only need to see a few moves just to make sure there's no main tactics against them, and just be able to follow on their pattern recognition and intuition. So in this position, even though bishop to e3 was slightly better according to the engine, with very precise play, bishop to e2 is just so much more natural, and even at a slight disadvantage, from a practical standpoint, this is probably a better move. It's much more simple to play, and you're less likely to make errors. But this example with two Grandmasters are very close because they're both very high rated and the position was pretty equal for most of the game. Let's go to a more practical example and how you can apply this principle. You don't have to see like 20 moves, you only have to see a few moves. And so that's where this Capablanca example comes in. This is a really cool game, or at the very least, the middle game concept is really cool here. In fact, I'm just going to skip right to the critical position. Now, Capablanca's peak rating is probably over 2,700, and so is he going to make a very amateurish mistake, or did he calculate just barely far enough? This is move 17 we're about to go on to. F5 was move 16 for black, and white's move will be move 17 in this game. But how far is Capablanca basically seen here? If I teleport to the end where resignation happened, it was move 59. And so how did he calculate all of that to this point? This seems superhuman. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, he did not have to calculate all of those moves to recognize that he would be better. He just had to calculate far enough to see where he thinks there's an advantage to be had. And so let me play a move that is probably going to make a lot of intermediate players probably cringe a little bit. And even a lot of the advanced players are going to be kind of scratching their heads going, why would Capablanca play this? Now, before I describe this move that looks really terrible, we have to take a little bit like Jeremy Silman and evaluate some of the imbalances here. Material is equal, king safety looks roughly the same. But the important part, it looks like, is that white has doubled pawns. And that's probably going to be weakened upon endgame, or an endgame with very few pieces left. And then, of course, the other big detail is that both sides have a rook on the only open file of the board, and so play is probably going to be around either a weakness, like the doubled pawns, or trying to maintain control of that file and take it from the other side. So let's play the move that kind of makes you cringe a little bit. Rook captures e8. Beginning players might not realize how bad this is, but it looks really terrible because you had both sides with one rook on the open file, and after black recaptures, now black has entire control of the file. You've voluntarily given up the only open file on the board, and you still have the weak doubled pawns here. And now Capablanca plays his other rook over, and I'm just like, if you don't understand far enough, why are you giving up your entire advantage? And luckily, Capablanca, of course, saw this, and he saw a little bit further. Of course, he saw the rook trades, and it looks like now black is going to be better. Knight to f6, bringing this knight to this really strong outpost, and white can never really capture the knight because this pawn will recapture, and now they'll have a really strong pass pawn on e4 that'll probably decide the endgame. And especially with white having doubled pawns, it looks like Capablanca has just thrown away the entire advantage. Now, I guarantee you that before Capablanca gave up the rooks, he had to have seen this continuation, but it is not as far as it appears. Knight to f6 as anticipated, king to d2, knight to e4 check. It looks like now they're checking and winning the double pawn, but now king to e3. And that's simply it. Capablanca did not have to calculate all the way to move 59, he just had to see that this position was actually about equal or winning for him. And so for a Grandmaster, it's not too hard to calculate a little bit further and realize that this pawn is not safe to be taken. If black captures this pawn, then king to f4 is really strong. This knight is super close to getting trapped. Keep in mind, it can't retreat here because of the bishop. And so really the main idea to try and save the knight would be knight back to f1, but then bishop to e2 almost forces it to d2. If your knight goes to h2, then king here will trap the knight. And so after knight d2, king captures f5. Capablanca's gotten the material back, and he has a slight advantage that's probably going to win the game. Now, a lot of lower rated players will probably be like, this isn't so great, material is equal, I don't know how to win from here, but this is where endgame study is so important. Because if you recognize that this position is winning, then you don't need to calculate all the deep lines from this point, you just have to realize this is winning, and then just kind of wing it from there. So let me share for everyone why this is better for white. Black pretty much has to stop the king, because if they don't play king to f7, white is just going to march their king in and start winning the pawns here. And the problem is this black knight is actually pretty much useless. Notice it can really only go to b1, and if it goes to b1, it can never go to these squares because this pawn is controlling them. This bishop just does a really good job at controlling all the squares it can go to. And if you try bringing your knight back, you're simply losing to king e6, and there's no way you're going to stop this pawn from being lost. Say something like this, king d7, and it's pretty clear to see that the knight can never go here because the king will be defending that square, and then they're just threatening to win here. And if this pawn advances, they'll win this pawn. Everything is just collapsing. But of course, after they take the pawn here, they don't have to go to f1, knight to e4. But then simply king captures f5, and similar to what we looked at, this king is just going to march in and take all those pawns. And if black ever tries to go something like this, then you can capture, you take back, and now you're just winning material and have a winning pawn endgame. But of course you might realize they don't have to capture the doubled pawn. So where can the black knight go? Well, knight d6 was what was played in the game, but then simply bishop to e2, bringing the king up, and then king to f4. Capablanca could have started with king f4 earlier, attacking this pawn, but whether now or later, bishop e2 is just going to relocate to d3, put pressure here, and it's much easier for white to play. And so once again, it comes down to your understanding of endgames. Capablanca did not have to see 20 moves deep, and from an imbalance standpoint, this is going to be much easier for white to play, because in the endgame with a knight versus a bishop, very often the bishop is going to be better when there's pawns on both sides of the board. If there's pawns on both the queen side and the king side, the scope of the bishop is so long range that in one move it can travel very far across the board. And in a case like here, even control two sides of the board at once, the queen side and the king side. The knight, on the other hand, is going to take so long hopping really slowly from one side of the board to the other, it's not going to be able to keep up with the bishop. If the pawns are only concentrated on one side of the board, the knight can much better navigate those. Or if it's a closed position, the knight can kind of hop around, and its jumping ability is to its advantage. But let's continue with the endgame. The threat is the white king coming into e5, infiltrating, attacking the knight, and again going after this pawn. So black has to stop this, play king to f6. Keep the king out of e5. But now a little bit of endgame play here, trying to get rid of the doubled pawn weakness. Capablanca does it with this check, and then following up a pawn g4, and voila, he's gotten rid of his doubled pawn. But rather than capturing g4 with the king or bishop, which would be a draw, Capablanca ignores the material and plays bishop to d3, which gives black the opportunity to go wrong here. If they try and be materialistic and protect this pawn, then white can capture on g4, and in the game there was this interference try, capture on g4, and this is actually winning for white. Black captured the pawn, white captures here, and now we see how this pass pawn is going to be very dangerous. What's basically going to happen is the king or knight is going to have to try and sit here and stop the pawn from becoming a queen. That'll free up this bishop to start going here and gobbling up these pawns, or forcing the pawns to advance to dark squares. That probably means that Capablanca is going to advance his pawns to put black in Zugzwang, and all of these other complications, which will take way more than 10 or 20 moves. But once again, he does not have to see all of those moves at this point. He just has to recognize that this is a winning position, and then he can make all of the right decisions as they come up in the game. By no means was it a flawless conversion, but I'll breeze through the moves and you'll just get a sense of what happened, which is exactly what I described. We're going here to try and stop the pass pawn. This bishop goes behind the pawns on the other flank. g6 is still winning, but just to illustrate this concept even better, best according to the engine was bishop d7, and you're just really restricting all of these squares the knight could go to. You could similarly control the knight really well if your bishop was on g4, which happened a little bit later in the game, but in either case you're corralling the knight, you're making black run out of pawn moves that are meaningful. The g-file is going to be decisive for white's advantage. But g6 was played, still winning. Everything I mentioned continues, fixing all of black's pawns so they basically have no good moves. Notice push this pawn, it gets lost. Push this pawn, it gets lost. Same concept here. And slowly but surely black is going to be running out of moves. We'll see the knight keep shuffling around. Eventually the king has all the time in the world for white to get all the way to a7. Black can't really do much in this slow maneuvering game. And eventually white's king gets there. Now white is up the material. More maneuvering once again. A little bit of shuffling. And then this check looks like it'll finally get rid of the bishop. But after the king move, there is no way to stop the g-pawn. And this is the final position that we looked at. The knight could not capture the bishop because then you would just be able to promote. And the black king is too far away to do anything. And if you just ignore the bishop with something else other than the move that was played, you have the same problem. You can just push the pawn, and even if you capture here, it's going to become a queen. So once again, did Capablanca see all the way to the end on move 59 here? And the answer is probably no. All they had to see was on move 17. They probably just saw that trading everything off of the board here, and then getting the king up, and the fact that this pawn could not be taken was probably enough for Capablanca to realize this is at least equal for him and probably winning. And as we saw, he slowly outplayed his opponent and won the game. But okay, that's really far. We're looking at Grandmasters here. How could a lower rated player apply this to their own games? Well, enter yours truly, much lower rated player. Let's get to an interesting position in this game, which was an unrated rapid game against a friend of mine from like 3 years ago. And so the critical position to look at, move 37 of the game. This king was on f2, and apparently with really strong engine defense, king e2 was the drawing move. And apparently that's an equal endgame. But instead, the very natural king to e3 brings the king up towards the center, which you usually want to do in the endgame. But in this case, it loses to only one move. So let's breeze through the game and how it really went, and then I'll show how far I actually looked in the game. The real game continued e5, very shocking looking move. The game went like this, and it's this beautiful cascade looking effect where the pawns keep advancing, and then sacrifice the queen, king to c3, and then we trap the white king on the edge of the board here. They have to step back, and that allows black to finally win the a-pawn. They eventually resigned because by the time that they get to this pawn, our king is going to advance all the way to here, grab this pawn as well, and then the two pass pawns are going to win the game for us. So how far did I see out of all of that? Well, I only really had to see like one move, and maybe a little bit would be a bonus. All I had to see was that after e5, if they capture back, I have king captures e5. That's it. I already knew this was winning. See, this is why pawn endgames are so important. I got the king opposition from white because there's one square between the kings, and white has no meaningful pawn moves left. If they push here, I'll take the free pawn. If they push here, capturing with either the a or c pawn is going to be winning because they can't stop me from getting a queen or getting my king to infiltrate. And so if it's a bit unclear to you why this position is winning with king opposition, then take a look at this chess video I made a while ago on this exact endgame, which is definitely a must-know endgame. I especially recommend this to beginners, or even people rated under 1,000 or 1,200 or so, because if you know how to do this and your opponent doesn't, that is a massive advantage to you. It's also a big confidence boost to be able to convert into a win with just one pawn, and so really every chess player should know this endgame. Not only to be able to do it in your own games, but also to see it in advance. For example, here, we're not at a position where I have one pawn against their king. There's many more pawns on the board, but I can foresee how we're going to use this same concept to win in this endgame. Okay, but my one move only works if you realize that they capture. But if they don't capture, as they are not obligated to, we have to see really deep calculation to see where we're winning. Well, the secret is it's not that deep. Let's say they keep the tension, play a move like king to f3. Now the winner is pawn to e4 check. And the fact it's a check doesn't even really matter much as long as you understand the idea. Once I saw this, I trusted the position and I just knew I was winning. Didn't have to calculate anything after this point. And it's not a superpower. I'll put the moves on the board instead of being like Nakamura with a bunch of arrows, but I'll show you how this is winning for black. So the key here is white really has no good pawn moves. So really it's just about making their king run out of space. And they're very close to doing that already, because their king cannot go too far away. They have to keep this pass pawn under control. So white is probably going to shuffle their king between these two squares, keep our king from trying to infiltrate and then helping this pawn promote. And if they can keep us from doing that, then they'll be able to hold the draw. But as I intuitively knew, without having to calculate, I can always find a way to force my king in. Let's take a look. King g4, king e6, them shuffling on these two squares, trying to keep my king from advancing. But now we see the new threat, which is simply bring my king over here and advance this pawn to h5. We'll get to that point. And now we'll see the value of this pawn on h5. It's guarding this square that the king was shuffling between. And also this pawn is controlling here, which means that the king will have to step backwards eventually. And when the king steps backwards, we're going to be able to try and infiltrate with our king. I'll play a few more moves by circling around, then we'll look at some variations. Eventually you'll see my king is coming in, they must step back, and then my king goes forward, it'll probably grab this pawn, probably take here, and they just cannot stop three pass pawns. Now there's two variations you have to see, or intuitively trust as I did that they existed. The first one is you have to realize, okay, what happens after h5 if they capture en passant? Well, if they do that, we'll capture with our king. They can try and shield us out, and this is going to decoy their king just far enough for us to advance and capture their h-pawn, and now we've only traded one pass pawn for another. They got the e-pawn, but they cannot stop the g-pawn. If you can't yet see why this is winning for black, again, that pawn endgame video is going to help you a lot, but I'll just play a few more moves, and you'll see that, like here, we now have the king opposition, and this is good enough for black to win a game. The other defensive try is, of course, instead of running here and shuffling between these squares, or stopping the h-pawn as we saw, which ended up failing, they could also try defending by going this way, capturing the pawn, and then this pawn is going to try and promote. But you'll quickly see why this loses as soon as you see our e3 pawn advancing. And if they come back, they're just too slow, we're going to promote the pawn. And if you capture here to try and promote your own pawn, you are just way behind. This is a queen, and this pawn is so far from promoting. And so that's all the concrete calculation that Hikaru Nakamura might be able to show off. But really, in this position, I didn't have to see 10-20 moves plus. All I had to see was e5 is actually winning because of this and then king opposition. Or if they move somewhere and I push here, this pass pawn is going to win me the game. And my king won't be able to be prevented from infiltrating. So I like to call that a master plan. When you see something like 10 or 20 moves in advance, it's not that you have to calculate all of those moves. You just have to understand the main concepts of the position, and then you can form this kind of overarching master plan from that. For example, here, I didn't have to see all of those moves. My master plan here was just realizing, oh, long term, this pass pawn is going to win me the game, or my king is going to be able to get in. And the rest is just working out the nuances that I know exist because of my pattern recognition and intuition that this is a winning position. Now, how do you build that for yourself? That's where endgame study becomes really important. If you learn the basics like the pawn endgame that I mentioned in that other video, then you can see that simple endgame much more in advance. And this is essentially what Grandmasters do with a lot of positions. Not only endgames, but also how some middle games can be steered into those endgames. And so that's why a Grandmaster only has to look maybe 2 or 3 moves ahead in most positions. So it was a bit of a different video, but hopefully this concept will help you a lot. It'll seem like you're actually calculating 10 or 20 moves in advance, when in reality, you only have to see a few key moves if you can identify that the following position will be winning. I think one of my favorite examples of that is the Capablanca game that we just saw. Rook captures e8 is a terrible move because it gives up the file if you don't see further. And in most positions, that'll probably be a mistake. But all that you had to see was that after this, and the knight advancing, king to e3 is slightly better for white, even if just at least practical play, because this pawn cannot be captured. And I can almost guarantee you that that's all Capablanca had to see in this game. He didn't have to see all the endgame nuances we looked at. He just had to understand that this position here was equal or winning for him, and that was enough for him to go for it. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.